Imagine a world where science isn't used to heal, but to destroy. A world where doctors, once entrusted with the sacred task of saving lives, turn their skills to sadism, experimenting on humans with no regard for morality, compassion, or the most basic human rights. This was the reality under the Nazi regime, where the obsession with racial purity led to the darkest medical experiments ever conceived. Fueled by the belief that certain races were inferior, the Nazis turned concentration camps into gruesome laboratories where human lives were treated as expendable test subjects in the name of twisted scientific progress. The most horrific experiments came in many forms. Prisoners were subjected to freezing temperatures, their bodies pushed to the brink of death to test human endurance. The Nazis conducted mass sterilizations, forcing women to undergo invasive, life-altering surgeries with no consent, all in the name of creating a master race, and perhaps most disturbing of all, the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, focused on experimenting on twins, injecting them with deadly substances, mutilating them, and even performing surgeries with no anesthesia, treating them as little more than lab rats for his grotesque agenda. But these medical atrocities didn't just end in death. They tore apart the very fabric of humanity. The suffering these victims endured didn't just leave scars on their bodies. It left permanent, haunting marks on the course of history. What happened in those hidden laboratories was not just a chapter in war. It was a glimpse into the darkest depths of human cruelty. The legacy of these medical horrors still reverberates today, a reminder of how far humanity can fall when unchecked power, ideology, and science collide. These were not monsters in lab coats. These were men who had once sworn an oath to protect life. Many of the doctors who became the architects of these unspeakable horrors were once respected professionals in their fields, trusted by society to heal and to help. But when the Nazi regime rose to power, their oaths were forgotten. They chose to abandon their ethical responsibility and instead became instruments of death. Men like Dr. Joseph Mengele, a name synonymous with the darkest experiments of the Holocaust, turned their knowledge of human anatomy into tools for torture. Mengele, who had once been a promising young doctor, became the Angel of Death in Auschwitz, where he performed sadistic experiments on thousands of victims, often with no more consideration than if they were mere cattle. These doctors didn't act out of personal hatred or madness. They were driven by an ideology. The Nazi regime's obsession with creating a master race gave them a sense of twisted purpose. They saw themselves not as torturers, but as pioneers, working toward a future where only the superior race would survive. To them, the suffering they inflicted on their victims wasn't inhumane. It was scientific. The Nazis justified their actions by portraying their experiments as a necessary means to an end, the creation of a perfect Aryan race. People who were deemed unworthy, Jews, Romani, disabled individuals, and others, were viewed as expendable. Their pain and death serving the larger goal of racial purity. Dr. Mengele, in particular, was obsessed with twins. He saw them as the ultimate subjects for his experiments, believing that by manipulating their genetics, he could unlock the secrets to human perfection. Twins were subjected to grotesque procedures. Many were injected with toxic substances, dissected alive, or forced to undergo surgeries without anesthesia. Mengele and his colleagues justified these acts by viewing the victims as objects in their experiment to understand heredity, completely ignoring the fact that they were human beings. To these doctors, the pain, the screams, and the deaths meant nothing. Their scientific pursuits were all that mattered. These men became executioners, not with guns, but with scalpels, needles, and syringes, forever altering the lives of those they subjected to their gruesome experiments. What made these men even more terrifying wasn't just their ability to inflict suffering. It was their ability to convince themselves they were doing good. They were convinced their work was necessary for the future of humanity. But in reality, it was nothing more than a perverse abuse of power, a betrayal of everything medicine stands for. Imagine being submerged in ice, cold water. Your body immediately shutting down as the freezing temperature begins to consume you from the inside. This was the fate of countless victims, subjected to the Nazis' freezing experiments. Prisoners, often Jews or Romani, were forced into these hellish trials in the name of science. The goal: to understand how the human body reacts to extreme cold, specifically to improve the survival rate of Nazi soldiers fighting in the harsh winters on the Eastern Front. But this so-called scientific inquiry was nothing more than a monstrous exercise in cruelty, with no regard for the agony of the people subjected to it. The experiments took many forms, but all had one thing in common: unspeakable suffering. Prisoners were dunked into freezing water for prolonged periods, sometimes up to several hours, their bodies growing numb and their skin turning an unnatural shade of blue. Some were left exposed to the elements, stripped of their clothing, tethered to the ground, and left to freeze. The cold seeped into their bones, causing their organs to shut down as frostbite began to claim their limbs. The pain was excruciating. Victims could feel their flesh dying, their blood thickening as their bodies struggled to maintain even a trace of warmth. Their hearts slowed to a near halt as hypothermia set in, and for many, death was a slow and merciless companion. For those who somehow survived, the physical toll was just the beginning. The survivors were left with permanent scars, both physical and psychological. Many had to have limbs amputated after frostbite had ravaged their bodies. Some were left with deep, festering wounds, their skin permanently discolored, and their fingers and toes blackened. Those who made it through the freezing experiments were marked for life, their bodies broken beyond repair. But the emotional scars ran deeper. Survivors were haunted by the excruciating pain they had endured, by the images of their fellow prisoners who didn't survive, their frozen bodies strewn about the cold, lifeless ground. Even as the war ended, these survivors lived on. But they were left with memories that no one could understand. Memories of the cold, the screams, and the death that surrounded them. The Nazis didn't just freeze their victims in the physical sense. They froze their humanity. These experiments were not about survival or understanding. They were about inflicting pain and testing how much the human body could withstand. The survivors were not seen as human beings, but as objects of experimentation, disposable, expendable. And in the process, the Nazis proved not just how cruel they could be, but how little they valued life itself. What happened to those prisoners was not just medical experimentation. It was an act of monstrous dehumanization, a grotesque act of violence that left the victims physically and mentally scarred for the rest of their lives. Dr. Joseph Mengel's obsession with twins went far beyond mere scientific curiosity. It was a sadistic pursuit of genetic perfection, a nightmarish experiment that viewed human beings as nothing more than disposable subjects. Mengel, a man who had once sworn to save lives, turned his medical knowledge into tools of torture, driven by the belief that he could unlock the secrets of heredity to create a superior race. His laboratory was a place where innocence was torn apart, and children, innocent twins, were the targets of his monstrous experiments. Mengel selected twins from the thousands of prisoners sent to Auschwitz, often choosing the youngest, most vulnerable victims for his cruel investigations. The twins, torn from their families and stripped of their humanity, were subjected to horrific procedures. Mengel performed surgeries without anesthesia, opening their bodies as if they were animals for dissection. Some twins were injected with deadly pathogens to observe how their bodies reacted, while others were subjected to mutilations, often having limbs or organs removed while still alive. Mengele didn't care about the agony these children endured. His obsession with genetic purity blinded him to the simple truth. These were children, not experiments. The true horror of Mengele's experiments lay not just in the physical tortures, but in the psychological devastation he caused. Twins were often forced to watch their sibling endure unspeakable suffering, knowing that their own turn was coming. They lived in constant terror, their lives reduced to nothing more than pieces in a horrific puzzle. Some twins were stitched together. One body, two heads, a grotesque attempt to manipulate the human form to fit his twisted theories of genetic superiority. These experiments were not just painful. They were designed to break the spirit, to dehumanize the victims in the most brutal way possible. After the experiments, the majority of Mengele's victims were killed. There was no mercy, no reprieve for the children who had been subjected to his sadistic whims. Most were slaughtered in the gas chambers, their young lives extinguished like candles in the dark. Mengele's obsession with genetic purity had no place for compassion, no place for life. For him, these children were nothing more than pawns in a grotesque game to prove his theories of racial supremacy, a game in which the stakes were life and death, and the rules were written in the blood of innocent victims. Mengele's actions were not just experiments. They were a deliberate attempt to erase the humanity of his victims. His experiments on twins were a twisted extension of Nazi ideology. Where the worth of a life was measured by its genetic makeup, the Nazi eugenics program was a chilling extension of their genocidal ideology. An effort not just to exterminate undesirable individuals, but to completely reshape the human race. Their vision of racial purity didn't stop with mass killings. It extended to the very genes of the population. Forced sterilizations became a central part of this horrifying agenda, with the aim of eradicating what they deemed to be inferior bloodlines from German society. Those who didn't fit the Nazi ideal, whether due to physical disabilities, mental illness, ethnicity, or political beliefs, were subjected to cruel, invasive procedures designed to rob them of the most basic human right, the ability to reproduce. The forced sterilization policy was not only systematic but brutal. Tens of thousands of women, often without their knowledge or consent, were subjected to these surgeries. The Nazis believed that by removing the reproductive capabilities of those they deemed unfit, they could cleanse the population and build a future defined by Aryan racial purity. For many women, this was a fate worse than death, as they were denied the right to have children, a permanent, irreversible loss that no punishment could ever truly compensate for. Women who had been forcibly sterilized were often told that they were undergoing treatment for minor medical conditions, unaware that their reproductive organs would be permanently damaged. Some were subjected to hysterectomies, while others were sterilized through cruel, non-consensual surgeries. The physical scars left by these procedures were horrifying, but the psychological trauma was even more profound. Many of the women who survived these surgeries were left with deep emotional scars, struggling to cope with the loss of their fertility and the sense of personal violation. For women who had their children taken away from them, or were forcibly sterilized while already pregnant, the trauma was unimaginable. The Nazis had robbed them not only of their ability to have children, but also of their sense of self-worth, their dignity, and in many cases, their hope for the future. But the true horror of the Nazi eugenics policy wasn't just in the violation of individual bodies. It was in the collective destruction of entire communities. The Nazis didn't just target individuals. They sought to eliminate entire groups of people from the future of humanity. The program was designed to erase anyone who didn't meet the ideal Aryan standard. And in the process, it devastated families, cultures, and entire ethnic groups. Communities that had once been vibrant and full of life were torn apart, with families being forcibly separated children taken from their parents, and entire bloodlines erased from history. The social impact was catastrophic. Generations were lost, their voices silenced by an ideology that saw their lives as worthless. The Nazi eugenics program was not just an atrocity, it was an attempt to control life itself, to dictate who was allowed to exist and who was not. It was a monstrous abuse of power, rooted in hatred and fear, and carried out through manipulation of medicine and science. The disabled and mentally ill were among the first victims of the Nazi regime's horrific quest for racial purity. To the Nazis, these individuals were seen as unfit, burdens on society that needed to be eradicated in order to create a future dominated by the so-called Aryan race. The cruelty they endured under the Nazis was not just in their treatment, it was in the complete disregard for their humanity, reduced to nothing more than objects to be disposed of, their lives deemed unworthy of protection or care. The Nazis' policy of forced euthanasia was one of the most terrifying components of their eugenics program. Under the guise of cleansing society, thousands of mentally ill and disabled individuals were rounded up and sent to so-called hospitals, where they would be murdered in cold blood. The first step was often the most brutal. These victims were given lethal injections, their lives extinguished by those who had sworn an oath to heal, not harm. The injections were not just a method of execution. They were a part of a calculated, chillingly efficient system designed to wipe out those who didn't fit the Nazi ideal. But the euthanasia program didn't stop there. In the most gruesome experiments, the mentally ill and disabled were subjected to torturous medical trials meant to further the Nazi agenda. Victims were often left to suffer, their bodies used as tools in experiments that sought to understand the limits of human endurance, or to find solutions to erase genetic imperfections. Some were exposed to extreme conditions, while others were mutilated or injected with lethal substances to see how their bodies responded. These experiments were performed without any regard for consent, pain, or the sanctity of life. These individuals were nothing more than disposable subjects for the Nazi scientists, who twisted medicine into a weapon of destruction. For the families of these victims, the trauma was unimaginable. Many were left to mourn loved ones who had disappeared without explanation. The families never had the opportunity to say goodbye, never knew the true fate of their relatives. The victims' deaths were hidden in a veil of secrecy, and for those who survived, the emotional and psychological scars would last a lifetime. The pain of knowing that their loved ones had been murdered by the very system meant to protect them, treated as less than human, subjected to unspeakable horrors, left deep, lasting wounds. Even as the war ended and the world learned of the atrocities carried out by the Nazis, justice for the victims of these experiments was never fully realized. The perpetrators, including many of the doctors and officials responsible for the euthanasia program, were either not held accountable or were given minimal sentences. The families of the disabled and mentally ill victims were left with nothing but the knowledge of their loved ones suffering, a painful legacy that still lingers to this day. The trauma of these lost lives, the cruelty they endured, and the darkness of the Nazi regime's actions against them must never be forgotten, for they represent one of the most grotesque chapters in the history of human cruelty. The aftermath of Nazi medical experiments left deep, unhealable scars on the survivors. Many were left with permanent physical deformities, their bodies ravaged by the torturous procedures they had endured. Others were haunted by deep psychological trauma, nightmares, flashbacks, and the constant reminder of the horrors they survived. The trauma didn't end with the war. It lingered for the rest of their lives. The Nazis' medical experiments were built on ideology, cruelty, and a relentless thirst for power. Their war crimes left an indelible scar on history, showing us the horrific lengths humanity can fall to when cruelty knows no bounds. History is dark, and we must remember it.